The following program is a Town of Colony television production of the William K. Sanford Town Library.
Good afternoon and welcome, everyone. Welcome. It is just wonderful to see so many of you here this afternoon, and I very much appreciate your being here. Thank you. It's just more evidence of the fact that death with dignity issues, their time has come, right? So you are in on the ground floor of the development of a new group, Death with Dignity Albany. And this is a grassroots group whose mission is to provide a forum for sharing information and for discussion, talking about end-of-life issues, and to advocate for expansion of end-of-life choices. The group, in order to join the group, all you have to do is leave us your name and your email, and you're automatically in the group. No fee, no charge for joining, and if you would sign up on the sign-up lists that are up in the back table and that Natalie will bring around, you will start receiving our emails then, and you'll know about all future meetings. I'm Bonnie Edelstein. I organized this along with the very great help of one of our panelists, Giza Lopez. Thank you, Giza. It's been a great collaborator and a thinking partner, strategizing partner. And I also want to thank the library and Joe Nash, who is always a delight to work with. And thanks to Natalie over here, who is helping with logistics for today. Just a note in terms of logistics. You've all noticed that you have index cards on your seats. Those are for notes, comments, notes to us, comments to us, or questions. And so as the speakers go along, if you think of a question, you can write it down right away rather than trying to remember it at the end. And Natalie will help collect those cards. So let me introduce our speakers. I'll introduce all three at once, and then Giza will start off and hand things off. And if you see me sitting here doing hand signals, it's cutoffs to the panelists, so don't get worried that something terrible is happening. Giza Lopez, PhD, is a postdoctoral associate at the School of Criminal Justice, University at Albany, and author of Dying with Dignity, A Legal Approach on Assisted Death, to be published soon. And as a matter of fact, one of you during this program today is going to be the proud winner of a copy of Giza's book. So at some point during the afternoon, we'll tell you how that's going to work. And Giza is here today to talk about the history of the Death with Dignity movement in the United States. David Levin, JD, is Executive Director of End of Life Choices New York and has come up from the city. We appreciate that very much. David has played a leadership role in securing passage of legislation in New York to improve care and expand choice at life's end. And David will be speaking on current practices in New York regarding end-of-life care and decision-making, including palliative care, and current legal and legislative initiatives to establish aid in dying in New York. And Michael Brannigan, PhD, holds the Pfaff Endowed Chair in Ethics and Moral Values at the College of St. Rose, and also teaches at Albany Medical College's Alden March Bioethics Institute. and Michael will discuss ethical issues related to end-of-life choice. So enjoy the presentation, sign the sign-up sheet, and write your questions on your cards. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for making time today to engage in this very important, very timely conversation. Thanks to the library for hosting us. Thanks so much to Bonnie for the kind introduction and for everything that you do for this cause. Let's see if this is going to work. Yes. So I'm here today, as Bonnie said, to talk a little bit about the past, present, and tease out the future of death with dignity, particularly in New York. Let's start with definitions. When we talk about a death with dignity, I want to highlight what I understand it to be is a choice made by a terminally ill adult who is deemed competent, who makes a voluntary request to his or her doctor for a lethal prescription that he or she will self-administer whenever he or she chooses to do so, in order to hasten a certain death. Where is it legal in the US? Oregon was the first state where, by statute, this practice became legal. The first death under the Death with Dignity Act in Oregon happened in 1998. That state was followed by Washington in 2008 and Vermont a couple of years ago. 2 court rulings in Montana and New Mexico have opened the door to the practice, but in those states it's not regulated by statute. I'd like to offer an overview of how the process works. This is based on the Oregon law. As I said, there are certain requirements. The person making this choice has to be an adult, has to be terminally ill, deemed competent, and in this case, a resident of the state of Oregon. Once the prognosis is determined, there is an oral request made to the physician, a waiting period of about 2 weeks, followed by another request, and a written request that's signed before witnesses that have no stake in that request, cannot be relatives to the person making the request. At that point, the doctor asks if the patient is sure about that request. If yes, the request is referred to a second doctor who will ascertain the diagnosis, the prognosis, and the competency. If there's any suspicion that there's depression or other mental health issues at play, there's a referral to psychological support, and the process is halted. If not, there's a recommendation that the patient inform the next of kin. There's also an educational session on alternatives to death with dignity. It's not a requirement, it's a mere recommendation that one informs the next of kin. The prescription is then issued, and as a lethal substance, there's a lot of regulation that goes with it, and the data collection kicks in at this stage of the process. I'll get back to that later. Again, the prescription has to be self-administered, and in the US, it's done so orally. If the patient chooses to take that medication, I'd like to say that not everybody does. In fact, in Oregon, of the perhaps 1,400 prescriptions that have been issued since 1998, about 850 people actually chose to take the drug. If the prescription is ultimately taken, the death is recorded. These data are all collected by a government agency. The reports are made publicly available online. It's very easy to just look at how many prescriptions have been issued, who uses it, how often, and so on. You all might be familiar with Brittany Maynard. She was on the cover of People and many other media outlets last year around November. Brittany Maynard chose to die with dignity in Oregon. She was originally from California. If you're familiar with her story, in order to meet the residency requirement, she moved from California to Oregon, where she ultimately used the death with dignity law to hasten her death last November. And although she is very well known and helped reignite the debate on death with dignity, this is really a century-old issue in terms of legal reform. In terms of ideology, it's even older than that. I like to joke that it started with an expedition to the Arctic. This guy, Charles F. Hall, in the 1870s, obtained a little grant from the U.S. government to go study the Eskimos. And he jumped on a boat called Polaris, and he never came back. He died a mysterious death that later turns out to be a murder. But anyways, that's not important. The important part is when he got lost in the Arctic, and they couldn't recover his body, his family was granted $25,000 US by the US government. Imagine what a small fortune that was back then. And his daughter, his oldest daughter, Anna Hall, later in 1906 became what I think was the first activist to try to pursue legal reform in the area of aiding dying, specifically what became known as the chloroform bills, 2 bills that she, with the help of physicians and politicians, introduced in Ohio and Iowa in 1906. It's also an old issue in New York. The first bill that was ever recorded here was drafted in 1939. I put there the New York Times headline for you to see. I have a copy of that bill if anybody is interested. The bill was drafted but never introduced. 1939 was a year after the first social movement organization dealing with these issues was formed in New York. In fact, in America. I like to say that Brittany Maynard has forced us to move forward to the past. The 1939 bill that was drafted but not introduced in New York was one of many that have been introduced over the last 100 years. But we see now what the media has dubbed a Maynard Effect. After her death, Washington, D.C., and 20 other states, including New York, have been entertaining bills to change the legality of aiding dying. In New York, we have a lawsuit that David Levin's organization has initiated along with other plaintiffs. I'm sure he's going to get to that. And 3 bills currently being entertained. And what we have seen throughout this century-old attempt to reform the law in aiding dying is a lot of sound bites. And sound bites that typically claim that this practice would lead to coercion and abuse of vulnerable populations, proliferation of Dr. Kevorkians, and so on. These are headlines of the last 10 years. What we have an opportunity to do now is move beyond the sound bites and rely on sound evidence. Don't take my word for it. I have studied this issue for 10 years now, but so have other much more prominent people who have published on the New York Academy of Sciences, the New England Journal of Medicine, the Hastings Center, the Journal of Clinical Ethics, Journal of Medical Ethics, and so on. All of these were studies that have left no doubt that, one, there's no abuse, there's no coercion. We've now had 17 years to collect data in Oregon and about 6 in Washington, whereby we can really, I think, stand by the evidence and say that along with the values and the guidance of social activists such as David and Bonnie and Eleanor and so on, we now have evidence that this policy, if implemented as it has been in Oregon, does not lead to abuse, and in fact is very rare and safely utilized. That's my overview for today. Thank you so much for your attention.
I have a couple of questions for you. Bonnie asked you some questions, and my first question to you is, how many of you think you're going to die? It was a serious question, because, okay, most of you raised your hands, and that's good. So we're sort of on the same page, I think, and I've actually done a lot of studying of this issue, and we do have a 100% mortality rate. There's no study which concludes differently, so I'm happy to report that. So we should all, so the question really isn't whether or not we're going to die, but how we're going to die. And too many people in this country die badly. There are reports that have come out in recent months, one from the Institute of Medicine called Dying in America, which revealed that our system is almost broken at the end of life when it comes to medical care, medical treatment, despite the fact that we now have some good palliative care programs and hospice programs which are terrific, which is the gold standard of end-of-life care. And yet in New York, only about 25% of those who die actually die enrolled in hospice, compared to a 50% national average. It's disgraceful, and that has to change. So let me ask you folks another question. How many of you here today so far are in favor of what Jesus described as aid in dying? Okay, and how many of you are opposed? I hope we can change your mind by the end of the discussion today. How many of you are on the fence? Okay. So let me talk a little bit more about the issue of aid in dying and what our rights are generally, first, when it comes to ending our lives. We have absolute rights as patients, as consumers of the medical care system, to do what we want with our bodies in general. We have an absolute right to accept or reject any medical treatment that is offered to us at any time. We don't even have to be terminally ill. For example, Christopher Reeve, Superman, needed a ventilator to continue to live for a while after he fell off a horse and was a quadriplegic. At any point in time, he could have said, no more. My life isn't of value to me the way I'm living. Please have the ventilator withdrawn. And he would have died because it was a life-sustaining treatment at that point. If you are terminally ill, you have a right to say, no, I don't want a feeding tube. No, I don't want dialysis. Or if it's already started, you have an absolute right to say, I want this treatment withdrawn. Dialysis, antibiotics, a ventilator, feeding tube, whatever it might be. You have that absolute right as long as you are mentally competent. And what is interesting about this issue when it comes to aid in dying is that people can make decisions for you to end your life if that's what you've said you wanted at some particular time. If you've lost decision-making capacity and you've appointed a healthcare agent pursuant to completing a healthcare proxy document, and I hope all of you have, because that is the best way to hopefully ensure that your healthcare wishes are going to be respected, your healthcare agent can make the same decision that you could otherwise have made yourself to have life-sustaining treatment withdrawn, which will hasten your death. We know that all suffering can't be controlled. And that's why some people do, at the end of life, hasten their deaths. Because they are suffering and they feel they can't go on living. As precious as life is, there comes a point when many people say, enough is enough. I want to keep on living, but I can't. And I want the choice as to how I'm going to die. So withholding or withdrawing life-sustaining treatment is a choice which mentally competent people can make, or healthcare agents can make for their loved ones. We know that all physical symptoms can't be controlled either, and that's why we have a thing called palliative sedation, where people can be sedated to unconsciousness, and life-sustaining treatment is withdrawn, and they'll usually die within 10 to 14 days or so. People have a right to voluntarily stop eating and drinking, which is also a peaceful, dignified way of dying for people who are terminally ill. They usually die within 10 to 14 days. And now we also should have the right to aid in dying. As Jesus mentioned, it's a right that only exists right now in 5 states. And in New Mexico, there's a lower court decision which is on appeal. We hope that it's going to be successful. It's been a very difficult process to try to establish aid in dying throughout this country for a lot of different reasons. But most of those reasons are invalid. People call this a suicide. It's not a suicide. It's not an assisted suicide. It's not physician-assisted suicide. It is so much different than a typical suicide. A typical suicide involves a person who could continue to live, but because of their life circumstances chooses to die. A person who chooses aid in dying is going to die, and they're only choosing the method of their death and only hastening their death by a very short period of time. People who are suicidal and commit suicide are usually depressed and have life circumstances which have caused that depression. That is not so with people who choose aid in dying. Suicides are often, almost always, committed in isolation without any involvement of anybody else. That is just not true of aid in dying. It involves family members, physicians, of course. It's a peaceful, dignified way of dying. Suicides are tragic. Aid in dying is actually an act of empowerment for the individual and for family members. When people jumped out of the World Trade Center on 9/11, they had a choice as to how they were going to die, not whether they were going to die. They could have died by asphyxiation or by burning to death. They made a decision to jump instead to their deaths. Would any of us consider that to have been a suicide? These weren't people who wanted to die. They weren't suicidal. And the same is true of people who take advantage of aid in dying laws where they exist. These are people who would want to continue to live. Brittany Maynard said that repeatedly. I'm not suicidal. I don't want to die, but I am dying. What's killing me is my disease. I'm only going to hasten my death by a very short period of time. It is insulting to people who are dying to hear that they are going to commit suicide when they think that they're going to use this process. And as Jesus said, about 1/3 of people who actually get the medicines never take them. And they have to be self-administered. You have to be able to swallow the medicines themselves. So when some people say, well, we're going to be taking advantage of vulnerable populations, the elderly, people with disabilities, people without health insurance, it's simply not true. It's not true, first of all, because people have to self-administer and they have to be mentally competent. It's not true as well because we know from the evidence in Oregon, which Jesus was pointing out, that people who take advantage of this law are generally speaking college educated. Almost all of them have health insurance, 97%. 90% of people who take advantage of the aid in dying laws as they exist are receiving hospice care. They are getting the best possible care. And again, this is done openly. And it's not as if aid in dying is not going on around this country all over. It is. In fact, there was a study which showed that in states other than in Oregon, about 1 in 250 people die by assisted death. In Oregon, it's only 1 in 500. So over many years now, 17 years with the experience in Oregon, 500,000 people have died during that time. But only about 800, about 1 in 500 deaths are by aid in dying. So when opponents of aid in dying say, well, people are going to feel they have a duty to die, that's not the way people feel, obviously. That's why the law is being used so sparingly. Of course, other people will say then, if it's only being used so sparingly, then why is it needed? Well, it's needed to give those few people the choice as to how they're going to leave this world. This is an autonomous choice that every individual should be able to make. It's a choice about liberty. It's a choice about health justice. No one should be denied this choice. No dying person should have to suffer more than he or she is willing to endure. No dying person. And every person should have a right to choose how he or she is going to end his or her life. But it's also important to have aid in dying laws because it gives great comfort to thousands of others who are dying to know that they have this option available to them. It gives them an opportunity to continue to live and live as well as possible for their remaining time until such time as they decide to exercise their right under an aid in dying law or not. But at least they know that they have this right. And studies have shown that people who die by aid in dying actually are better off when it comes to their acceptance of the fact that they are dying and actually have better deaths. And family members say the same thing. Studies show that they do better in accepting their loved one's death. The issues raised about coercion. There's no evidence of any coercion having taken place over 17 years in Oregon. No harms have come from the Oregon experience whatsoever. In fact, coercion, it works the other way around. It's usually the dying person who has to persuade family members that this is a right choice for him or her. That's the way it usually works in practice. Without this practice, there are a lot of violent deaths. People feel they have no other option. That's what happened to Marcia Angel's father. Marcia Angel was the former executive editor of the New England Journal of Medicine. Her father lived in Washington, D.C. When he learned he had terminal cancer, he shot himself to death pretty quickly. What Marcia says about that is simply this. If we had had a law in Washington, D.C., which allowed my father to die by aid in dying with prescribed medicines, I am sure that the day he took his life by shooting himself would not have been his last day. He could have talked to my mother. He could have talked to me, a doctor. We would have talked about how things might go during the course of his disease. And at some point, he would have had a choice if he wanted to exercise that choice to take prescribed medicines. But the day he died violently would not have been his last day. Violent deaths are avoided, in fact, by aid in dying, where people can die peacefully, and people should have the right to die peacefully. There are some in the disabilities rights community who are opposed to aid in dying, and they say that they are going to be taken advantage of, that people will say that their lives are valueless, are worth less than the lives of other people. It is absolutely true that historically, people with disabilities have been discriminated against, and terribly. And that discrimination goes on even today in the medical care system. But think about it. If you have an aid in dying law where you have to take the medicines yourself, you have to be able to self-administer, how are you going to be seen by anyone, but more so yourself, as being valued less than other people? This is a decision which you have to make, and you should not be caring about what others think. And with this law, we have regulation in states which have the law on the books. It's not the underground practice which might go on elsewhere, where someone might try to persuade you to have a death which you would not want otherwise. I want to tell you about what Paul Spears has to say about people with disabilities. Paul Spears was in a wheelchair for the last 13, 14 years of his life after falling off a horse. He was a forensic neuropsychologist, died in 2013. He's on the faculty of MIT and Boston University School of Medicine. What he says is, as a wheelchair user, the principle of choice is one that is very important to me. It is also the driving force and the core principle of the Americans with Disabilities Act. Those in the disability community will get no argument from me that the disabled are often viewed as having an existence that others may not feel is worth living, that we are more vulnerable to discrimination and have been discriminated against by many institutional groups, including the medical profession. Some seem to fear legislation similar to the law in Oregon because they believe it will invite further discrimination. Indeed, many people probably will choose to end their lives because of the very limitations or handicaps that many Americans with disabilities live with every day. I will not dispute this. But Dr. Spears makes the excellent point that people with disabilities are far more vulnerable where laws governing aid in dying do not exist. He says, if, as our opponents maintain, the life of a person with a disability is less valued by society, then such patients are far better protected in Oregon, where the process is transparent and has safeguards. When I awoke paralyzed and discovered that I could no longer walk or control my bowels and bladder, death frankly seemed to me to be a pretty reasonable alternative. After peer counseling by another wheelchair user, I realized that these things were not worth dying for, and that no matter how great a disruption they seemed to me, then they were only an inconvenience. If I should face such a scenario, were I to lose what little control I have left of my body, then I still want the right to make such a choice. But it would be a choice that should only be available to me if I carried a terminal illness. It might not be your choice or that of 10 other people with disabilities or who use wheelchairs, but just as I would never presume to make a choice for you, please do not presume to make a choice for me. You do not have to somehow protect me from myself, from others, or from society just because I'm a wheelchair user. I prefer to protect myself. So it's not surprising, really, that even though some in the disability rights community oppose aid in dying, a substantial majority of people in those communities actually support aid in dying, about the same percentage of the public generally. 66% in Connecticut, 73% in New Jersey, 73% in Massachusetts, and 71% in New Jersey. We have filed a lawsuit recently in February in New York to establish aid in dying. I worked with a whole bunch of other people to get plaintiffs for the lawsuit. We now have 4 doctors, one who is the head of palliative care at the University of Rochester Medical Center, Tim Quill, Howard Grossman, who is an AIDS HIV doctor in Manhattan, and Sam Klagsbrun, who runs the Four Winds Hospitals, both in Westchester and in Saratoga, a psychiatrist. The patient plaintiffs are one who has cancer, one who has ALS, and one who has AIDS. Aside from our organization, End of Life Choices New York, and our clinical coordinator. We're represented by Catherine Tucker, who for 20 years almost was the Legal Affairs Director of Compassion and Choices nationally, is now the Executive Director of the Disability Rights Legal Center, and is the premier litigator in the field of aid in dying. The law firm of Debevoise and Plimpton in New York City is co-counseling the case on a pro bono basis. The case was filed in state Supreme Court in Manhattan and seeks to establish aid in dying by one of 2 means. The first asks the court, the lower court Supreme Court judge, to rule that aid in dying, the process of aid in dying, should not be considered to be a suicide, and therefore doctors should not be prohibited from prescribing life-ending medicines for their patients under the law which prohibits aiding in a suicide in New York. If the judge refuses to rule in that way, we seek a ruling from the judge that either under the Due Process Clause of the New York State Constitution and or the Equal Protection Clause of the New York State Constitution, that patients have a right to have these prescribed medicines that they can take at a time and place of their choosing. This case is likely to go on for 2 to 3 years. We think it is probably the most likely path to success to achieve aid in dying in New York. There are 3 bills pending, one of which we initiated, bills in both the state Senate and in the Assembly. The bill sponsored in the Senate by Senator Diane Savino. The bills in the Assembly are sponsored by Assemblywoman Rosenthal and Assemblywoman Paulin. It is hard to know exactly what will happen with those bills this year, but our expectation is, because they were newly introduced this year, that nothing will probably happen. There'll be study bills, essentially, and nothing probably will happen for at least 2 or 3 years, or maybe longer. This is somewhat of a politicized issue. It shouldn't be. But unfortunately, historically, the vast majority of Republicans have voted against bills of this nature, and the vast majority of Democrats have voted for them. So that is why it is so difficult to get bills passed in state legislatures. The Oregon and Washington laws were passed by ballot initiatives, by the voters. We can't do that in New York. We are a referendum state for certain things, for bond issues to change the Constitution, but not for issues like this. So we're going to have to depend upon either the courts or the legislature in order to establish aid in dying in New York. All of you should be working to make this goal happen. All of you should be talking about aid in dying and why it's so important to have this as a right for all of you and for any terminally ill, competent person in New York. All of you should talk about the arguments which we've been talking about this morning so that you can rebut things which are said, which simply are either not true or unfounded, which often happens. Arguments made by sometimes people with disabilities, sometimes by the Catholic Church or other religious groups, sometimes by people who are just simply ignorant and don't understand what this process is all about and how it works. This isn't about Dr. Kevorkian. It's not about him or anybody else doing anything to somebody. And it drives me nuts, frankly, when I hear some people who are very good palliative care doctors say, well, we're killing patients when we do this. It's not killing patients any more than when a doctor withdraws life-sustaining treatment. And when you think about it, when a doctor engages in that activity, he or she is a whole lot more active than when a doctor simply prescribes the life-ending medicines which the patient has to take him or herself. Which is more like killing? Removing the ventilator or prescribing the medicines? There simply aren't any legitimate arguments that can be made against aid in dying. Aid in dying eventually will be standard of care. Something which will be appropriate for some people, not for many. Something which doctors will continue to recognize as legitimate. And by the way, I should mention that increasingly doctors support aid in dying. 54% of doctors in this country now support aid in dying versus only 31% who are opposed. A huge difference. And although the American Medical Association has taken a position against aid in dying, the American Medical Women's Association supports aid in dying, as does the American Medical Students Association. So maybe women doctors are more compassionate. Younger students have more of an open mind about this issue and are supportive. The American Public Health Association supports aid in dying. And all these organizations, by the way, reject the term suicide or assisted suicide or physician-assisted suicide. And every law that has been passed and every bill that is pending says very clearly that the process of aid in dying is not to be considered a suicide, assisted suicide, homicide, euthanasia, whatever. Why? Because it's not. It is simply not. In conclusion, I know that the vast majority of you do support aid in dying. I hope, sir, that you will by the time we leave here this afternoon. Although if you don't, I hope that you'll raise questions and make comments as to what your concerns are. But this is a right that all of us should have when we're terminally ill. All of our loved ones should have this right. We need to work really, really hard to make sure this happens. And all of you should be contacting your legislators, asking them to support the aid in dying legislation or death with dignity. It's called different things, by the way. Each bill has a different name. One is called End-of-Life Options Bill. One is called the Patient Self-Determination Act. One is, I think, called the Choice in Dying Bill. But they all are pretty similar to each other and will have the same goal: the right to have aid in dying for the terminally ill. Thank you very much.
First of all, I'd like to thank Natalie, Bonnie, Gisa, and David for inviting me here. I'm very privileged to be with this esteemed panel. Thank you very much for your comments. I appreciate them. As you may or may not know, I'm a philosopher. And with the last name Brannigan, I'm certainly not Jewish. My grandfather was born in County Mayo. And my good friend John Thornton in the back has heard me share this story. When I told my grandfather that I said, "Hey, Grandpa, I'm gonna be a philosopher." I was like about 8th grade, because I was reading Plato and Aristotle then, and I said, "Hey, this is great. This is better than science fiction." My grandfather is smoking his pipe and looking at the lawn in the backyard, and he said, and he called me Michael, because he's the only one in my family who called me Michael. Everyone called me other names, Mick, Butch, whatever. And he's smoking his pipe, looking at the layout of the land, and he gave me this old Irish quip. And he said, "You know, Michael, you can never plow a field by turning it over in your mind." That always stayed with me. My grandfather was a philosopher. He knew what it was all about. He knew what life is all about. And it stuck with me. And I always go back with him. And when I get into philosophy in college, he and I would talk about plowing the field and turning it over in the mind. And I would often say, "But Grandpa, don't you think you have to turn it over in your mind to plow the field the right way?" He said, "Oh yeah, you're right, Michael. You're getting the hang of it, but you still have to plow the field." And he is so right. You know, Gisa and David, they're the plowers. They're plowing the field, and Bonnie and Natalie. And I've got the easy task of just turning it over in my mind. That's what we philosophers do. And I can go over the ethics, the issues, but I won't belabor that. I think we're all aware of the ethical issues, for and against. There are good reasons for, good reasons against. And David raised the prominent reasons against: slippery slope arguments, probable consequences, absolutely, the possibility of abuse. All of these are reasons, but I don't believe they're necessarily sound reasons. We can raise distinctions. We philosophers like to make distinctions about active and passive euthanasia. You know, the word euthanasia comes from the Greek, meaning good death. You know, a lot of people in passive euthanasia don't experience a good death. From my experience, I've worked in clinical medical ethics for years, and even though a person has chosen passive euthanasia, which is legally sanctioned, I don't think that they've had a good death. Personally, and I'll share this with you because I can't do this in my classroom. Because students will ask me, "Well, what do you think, Dr. Brannigan?" And my duty as a teacher to give all the sides, not just both sides, because there are many sides. Many sides. And we're a culture that tends to bifurcate issues, either for or against. There are many, many sides, many shades. Look at the abortion issue, right? I don't tell my students what I think personally, but I'll share that with you. Personally, I believe I have a moral right to make this decision regarding my life and my treatment. I believe I have a moral right that should I be in a specific situation where there is interminable pain, I do have a moral right to request from my caregiver a means through which I can take my own life. And I agree very much with David, that is not suicide. That's a choice. It's a rational choice. As long as I'm competent, lucid, I believe that. I have that moral right. But here's the rub. Because I believe it's a moral right, should I believe it should be acknowledged as such and be legalized? There's the rub in ethics between moral rights and legal rights. In an ideal world, our laws should be morally sound, but we do not live in an ideal world. So we live in that ever-present tension between law and morality. So I'm going to provide not the typical arguments against physician-assisted suicide, mislabeled, physician aid in dying. We're all familiar with that. But I'd like to just have a thought experiment with us, not to counter what Giza or David so nicely said. And I agree with both of them in many ways, personally. But I'd like to have us go forward into the future. Go ahead a few generations into our grandchildren's generation, maybe their children's generation, when physician aid in dying is sanctioned. Okay? Now, when I started teaching medical ethics, there was something missing in my approach. I was approaching it from a purely academic point of view. The best experience in my life to this day was becoming a hospice volunteer. And in New York, I was a hospice volunteer for over 10 years. That was the best experience in my life, aside from getting married, of course. Because Brooke's not here, so I can still say that. And I learned a lot of lessons. You learn a lot of lessons from people who are dying. You learn a lot of lessons from people who know they have very little time left. And what I learned is that people that I've worked with, they know they have very little time left. And their view of time is so much, I mean, every moment matters, every day matters. And their view of independence takes on another color as well. They know that they're not really isolated as much, they are dependent on others. So I've learned from my work in hospice programs that patients who have very little time left and know this, their view of time is vastly different from what people who are not dying have. People who take time for granted. And I know that from my lessons from people who are dying, their view of dependency takes on a different color as well, which is very different from our customary view if we're not in that situation. Sort of the other side of the fence, you know, the idea that, well, look at today's generation, the younger generation, who will be parents, and they will be grandparents. And they take time, I believe, time is taken for granted. We all do. We take it for granted. In fact, we want the quick fix. Give me the pill. Give me the medication. Struggle for something? Struggle for the A? Oh no. I want that A. I expect to have that A. In fact, because I had it throughout high school. Give me an A. I've had students tell me, you know, Dr. Brannigan, I hope I get an A in this class I've had throughout high school. And I look at them astounded. I said, well, no, A's are, the average grade for my classes are not A's, but if you're going to get an A, you have to really work for it. I don't know. Time is taken for granted. So we believe in the quick fix. We are a society that encourages independence. Dependency is sort of frowned upon in a sense. Well, I want to be my own person. So wind that ahead now, 50, 60, 70, 80 years from now, when physician aid in dying is legally sanctioned. So the question I pose to you is a thought experiment. Will the prevailing view of time and self and interaction, how will that be? How do you think that will unfold generations ahead? And how will that affect decision-making by people who are dying? I think that there is definitely ways that we can prevent abuse, but I don't see this as abuse. I'm talking about a socio-cultural prevailing ethos that exists now and that it seems to me will exist in the future, even more so. Again, I'm not opposed to, I feel that we need to legislate physician aid in dying. We need to plow the field. And we have to start somewhere, but we have to plow the field thoughtfully and think about what it is that we want and how we go about getting that. You see, so I'm not posing any answers. I don't have any answers. But these are questions that I deal with personally and relationally when I look at the future. And I look at my students and the future they face, which is going to be a real tough future for them. That's the world we're heading to. And I think we need to consider that socio-cultural kind of perspective. So thank you for your attention, and look forward to some questions and some answers.
Thank you so much to all three of you for being such well-informed and passionate speakers. Each of you really conveyed something that was very moving, and I could tell that there was no rustling of papers, and people were glued to what you were saying, so thank you for that. What I'd like to do is end on the note that we have here, and thank you so much for coming.